Well, there's a saying that good things come in threes. And so I'm really, really pleased that I get to introduce our third plenary speaker today, Dr. Andrea Dittmann, who's an assistant professor of organization and management at Goizeta Business School at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. She received her PhD in management and organization at Northwestern University at Kellogg School of Management, and then very quickly got a position at Emory. So she's an emerging scholar. Dr. Dittmann's research deals with inequality in professional workplaces, including how social class of one's upbringing can continue to shape obstacles and strengths in the workplace. Her work has been published in top academic outlets, including the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. Her work's been covered by media outlets, including the Harvard Business Review, Politico, and Christian Science Monitor. More recently, she's been investigating how experience of COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately affected people from lower versus higher social class contexts across a number of important life domains. This is all since 2020. And all her work is aimed at harnessing insights to create equity and inclusion for people in the workplace. So I'm very pleased. Join me in welcoming Dr. Andrea Dittmann.
All right, thank you so much for sticking around and making it to the final plenary session of the day, and thank you so much, Sue, for that wonderful introduction. I found myself being so inspired by the conference today thus far, and I really think that's a testament to the organization skills of Catherine and Colette and Sue, and I just feel like everything's flowed so nicely, and all the plenary talks that came before, and particularly a lot of the commentary that actually came up in that wonderful Q&A that we just had, really builds perfectly into the research that I really want to share with you all today, which is this concept of working together, maybe a simple sort of straightforward sounding thing, but what I've been studying for about the past decade is how that can really be a source of strength and a source of unique advantage for people from working class contexts, first generation students. And so I'll use those terms interchangeably, but I'm always kind of talking about first generation college students. It's just that I'm going to be sharing with you some studies with college students and then some studies with individuals who've actually graduated. And so I'll use that term coming from a working class background for our first generation college graduates. I don't need to introduce myself because Sue already did such a great job with that. So I want to get right into thinking about kind of this popular press narrative that we see when we kind of look out at the headlines about social class inequality in the world today. And this doesn't take you very long to sort of sense a theme and a trend emerging. So we can see headlines like, "The real reason why poor kids perform worse in school and life." "Sorry, being born rich still leads to more success than working hard in school." And this idea of a class pay gap, so even after university, how it's still paying to be privileged, even though everyone's attained a college degree. And then finally, along the pathway through one's career, how your social class of origin is still serving as this obstacle. And if you can sort of see, there's this deficit sort of narrative, right? That the reason that people from working class contexts are not doing as well as their upper class counterparts is because they're just lacking in skills or abilities. And if you look to sort of the academic literature on this as well, it kind of mirrors that narrative, right? So there's a lot of research now that suggests that compared to sort of their more advantaged middle and upper class counterparts, people who come from working class contexts tend to earn lower grades in college, obtain leadership positions in organizations once they've graduated from college less often, and actually earn about 17% less, even for those who've kind of made it to the upper echelons, these most elite jobs. And so at this point, you're probably noticing a trend. We tend to talk a lot about the obstacles that working class people face. And I'm not here to deny those obstacles. We know that those are absolutely real and difficult to overcome. What I want to suggest, though, that this is only reflecting really half the picture. And the interviews that I have done with people who came from different social class backgrounds really point to the other half of the picture. So I think Adriana, one of my interviewees from a working class background, she really sums up this perspective nicely. She says, "Knowing that I came to my full-time job at a little bit of a disadvantage, I knew that I had to work a little harder. But at the same time, there were a lot of great skills and values that my parents taught me. So it was just realizing that sometimes the disadvantage was an advantage." And so Adriana's realization that her social class background could be both the source of disadvantage and advantage really points to the power, I think, of taking more of a strengths-based approach to studying social class background. So while I'll obviously point to the situations and contexts where social class background serves as an obstacle, I really also seek to document the unique strengths of people from working class contexts. And in taking sort of this strengths-based perspective, I don't want to say that this is like an overly optimistic or rosy take on research. This is actually going to help us take a more holistic stance and understand the sources of and solutions to social class inequality. And it follows so nicely from some of the Q&A that we were having, because taking the strengths-based perspective really moves us away from sort of focusing on individuals and how individuals might be standing out differently from others who are from more privileged backgrounds, and actually centers on how the context and the structures and the cultural values that are accepted and taken for granted as the quote-unquote right way to be are really tending to systematically overlook or ignore or even actively devalue the unique strengths that are developed in working class contexts. And so now sort of thinking about these cultural disparities and how differences in norms and values could be sort of explaining why we have some of these social class gaps, when we look to college, we see this phenomenon that's been called cultural mismatch. The idea here is that college students from working class backgrounds, they bring with themselves to college these very interdependent motives and norms and values and understandings of themselves. And so I can show you kind of a little bit what that looks like. So this is research done by my doctoral advisor, Nicole Stevens. She had these motives for these reasons why you might be motivated to attend college. And they tap into these more interdependent, connected to others sensibilities, right? So they include things like being motivated to go to college because you want to provide a better life for your children, because you want to give back to your community, because you want to show that people from your background can do well, amongst many other related values. And she had a sample of first-generation college students and continuing generation college students complete this scale. And what she sees very consistently across all of these is that our first-generation college students are much more likely to endorse these more interdependent understandings and motives for going to college compared to their continuing generation counterparts. And I'll just show, if you kind of take the average of all of those individual items, you see a very clear pattern for the overall sort of scale mean there. And that's really important to understand kind of the motives and norms that you're bringing with you to college, but then it's also critical to kind of understand, is that aligned with or does it diverge from the norms that are prioritized in university? And it turns out that the typical university culture does not align with these more interdependent norms and motives of those from working class contexts. Instead, and as I think one of our panelists actually mentioned, the typical university culture really enacts and values independence or individualism, being unique and different from others. And so it's not hard to find examples of this in university promotional materials. So I'll just share one example, a welcome letter to Stanford University, highlighting some kind of individualistic sort of thinking in this blue text. I'm delighted that you have decided to attend Stanford and you think Stanford's the right place for you. For the next few years, you'll have many opportunities to explore new areas and to learn from our superb faculty and from your own personal exploration and individual experiences as a student. So in contrast to all of those interdependent motives that we were just hearing, we're seeing a very different picture that's being promoted by the university, right? You're gonna blaze your own path. You need to be unique and different from others. You need to really stand out and be unique. And so this creates what's been called a cultural mismatch in university. And that actually can explain why college students from working class backgrounds tend to feel like they don't belong and tend to feel as though they can't perform up to their potential in university contexts. But that is not the story that I started out this talk with, right? I started with this idea that working together is actually going to benefit first-generation students in college and beyond. So I'll show you how we can sort of actually change universities and change institutions to make them more inclusive and to make sure that those unique strengths of people from working class contexts actually shine through. So I'll start by sharing a couple studies that I've done in the context of higher education, where we're looking at the ways that we measure achievement. And do we measure it as an individual taking an exam or as like a group assignment? And so I'll share 2 studies from that line of research. I'll actually look at students' college course grades, so their actual college course grades. Then I am sort of trained in the social psychological method, so I'll also share with you a lab experiment that will sort of document some causality, that there is this causal relationship between working together and first-generation student success. I'm also, in a business school, so I have taken this research more recently. What happens after these first-generation college students graduate? Of course, they're most likely also the first person in their family to get a white-collar job. So what happens? Is the mismatch over at that point, or do they contend with a new form of mismatch in the workplace? And so I'll share with you just one experiment from a line of studies that we've done in the workplace in examining this idea of working together. So first, again, I'll start with these studies in the context of higher education. And I'll start with this idea that there are multiple ways to measure achievement, right? One tends to be more common and dominant and normative in universities, and that is this idea of assessing people as they are working individually, right? So much of our coursework and the way that we assess our students is as they are completing individual tasks or completing and achieving individual goals. You have to kind of put your head down and take an individual college entrance exam. We heard something about like the GRE. All of these things are done as an individual. In contrast, you can imagine that there are also other ways to assess students. You can have them perform the exact same task, but you could actually have them doing it in an interdependent working together setting where they'd actually would require them to kind of coordinate with other people to complete collective tasks or achieve shared goals. And so kind of thinking back to those more interdependent motives that I was sharing with you that these college students from working class backgrounds tend to have, we kind of theorized that if we could actually create these measures of achievement that actually harness these skills of working together, that actually might create a cultural match for students from working class contexts. And so what we want to argue in this work is that, the way that typically universities assess students is as they're working individually. And that does not align with these more interdependent norms and values of students from working class backgrounds. And so that is really the reason that they're going to report having worse experiences and worse performance in this context. Nothing to do with their skills or ability, just really the way the task is actually structured. In contrast, we theorize that the exact same type of achievement task, instead done in sort of a team or a group setting, would actually align really nicely with those more interdependent norms and values of people from working class contexts, in fact, lead them to have better experiences and perhaps even outperform their more advantaged counterparts from middle class contexts. And to just sort of hint at the possibility that this might be a case, I'll again share another quote from one of my interviewees from a working class background, Laura. She explains, "Growing up in a home environment with a strong, close-knit family, I think that helped me before work learn how to create strong relationships with people, but also leverage them to be successful in my projects." And so Laura's sort of understanding that she had these unique skills at being able to connect with people and build relationships, she actually viewed as a unique source of strength for her in the workplace. And so we theorize that this might actually be able to play out in our data. And so first, again, I'll share with you a study of students' college course grades. And this was a study done in a business school, so I was able to gain access to the first generation student status as well as their performance in the course on a number of assignments. But there was a really nice feature of this class that enabled this sort of first real world test of this working together versus individually phenomenon, and that is that the course already included individual assignments and team assignments. So 65% of the final grade was those kind of classic academic individual assignments, individual essays, individual exams, things like that. But importantly for our purposes, 35% of the grade were these team assignments culminating in a final team project that they completed across the semester. And so that enabled us to sort of not look at the overall grade, but actually break it out by how students were actually performing on these assignments to see if there was this difference. And so first, I'll turn to the results regarding our individual assignment grades. And so if you'll remember, what I was theorizing is that this is why we will see a social class achievement gap, because this is not aligning with the more interdependent norms and values of those from working class contexts. And so when we turn to the results, and I'll always represent individuals from working class backgrounds with orange bars and individuals from middle class backgrounds with blue bars, we do see this social class achievement gap emerging, right? So this is kind of replicating all of that negative sort of deficit story that I shared with you at the beginning. But importantly, we're not going to stop there, right? Next, we looked at the team assignment grades. And so for the team assignment grades, each individual in the team earned the same kind of overall team score. So the way that we looked at this is actually looking at the number of working class students on the team. Was it 0 working class students, 1, 2, 3, or more? And we see a very different pattern of results when we instead look at performance on team assignments. Instead, we actually see that there is an advantage to having more working class students on a team. So the more working class students on a team, the better that team is actually performing. And so again, this is the exact inverse of what you might expect given sort of the classic sort of social class achievement gap narrative, right? This is actually showing that these students have an advantage perhaps at working together. But of course, this is just sort of a correlational study. Being kind of the experimentally trained researcher that I am, I didn't want to leave it there. I wanted to next sort of test this causally. So I tried to conduct an experiment where we could kind of isolate the effect of working individually or together on performance. And so the design of the study is we actually brought in nearly 300 college students in the US, and we actually had their social class background information. They had previously completed a demographic questionnaire, so we could a priori sort of identify who is a first generation student, who's a continuing generation student. We brought them into the lab and we randomly assigned them to one of two conditions. And the only thing that differed is that they were either working on this achievement task by themselves or they were working on it in a social class matched pair. Again, we really wanted to isolate the effect of social class in this experiment, so we had the dyads actually being composed of both continuing gen or both working class students. I'll share in just a moment kind of what the task they were working on looked like, but again, they were randomly assigned to either work on this task individually or together. We then sort of had them complete a survey about their experiences while working on the task, like how much did you feel comfortable, did you feel like you fit in with the structure of this task, and also because of the task we chose, it had a correct answer, and so we were actually able to assess their objective performance. The last thing that we did is really wanted to understand why there might be this advantage for first generation individuals at working together. So for the groups that were actually working together on the task, we video recorded them, and then we had a trained team of research assistants actually code the behaviors that these groups were engaging in to try to understand the process or kind of some of the reasons why our first gen teams might be performing better. So before I get to the results, I'll just kind of share with you the tasks. It's kind of an interesting task. So this task that we use is called the lost at sea task. And so you're kind of given this sort of hypothetical survival scenario, and you're trying to survive when you're lost at sea. You're given a list of 15 items that you have at your disposal for your survival, but you need to rank order them because you can't really keep them all with you. So you have to identify which is the most important to your survival, which is the least important to your survival. And the benefit of this task is that it really requires you to work interdependently, right? You can't just sort of divide and conquer and split up the items and kind of work by yourself, which is something that we observed that our middle class participants really like to do. They don't really like to work in teams, right? They want to like just sort of divvy things up and like we'll check back in at the end of the assignment. So the structure of this ranking task really made it and kind of forced that sort of more interdependent collaboration. Okay. So first, for the results I'll share with you is just people's self-reported experience in the task. How much did they feel like this was a fit with their skills and abilities performing the task either as an individual or as working together? And this is what the pattern of results look like. And so I'll just call out a couple comparisons that are most important for our purposes today. So first, you'll see that compared to when they're working individually, people from working class contexts are actually reporting a better experience, a greater sense of fit with the task when they're performing it in a group compared to when they perform it individually. And then if you look at the right-hand side of the graph, in particular, what was really interesting here is that they actually report feeling a greater sense of fit compared to their counterparts from middle-class backgrounds. So again, kind of turning that social class achievement gap narrative on its head, we're actually finding a situation where first-generation students actually feel more comfortable and feel more able to kind of perform up to their potential. And we see that pattern replicated when we actually look at their objective performance on the task. And so what you can see again is that there's a significant boost when they're working together in these groups, our students from working class backgrounds are actually performing much better than they were when they were working individually. But again, I really want to draw your attention to the right-hand side of the graph, which is really like the most exciting and unsurprising finding for us, which was actually that our groups from working class contexts significantly outperformed our groups from middle class contexts. Again, a complete inverse of that classic, what we think of a social class achievement gap. And so again, this is an experiment, so this begins to tell us that there is some causal relationship between actually structuring achievement tasks in a team or a group setting compared to as individuals. And so, of course, we wanted to understand, okay, we see this performance advantage. We see that they feel more comfortable performing the task in this way. But why is it that they're actually performing better? And again, I mentioned we had research assistants actually code the behaviors of people working together. And so it turns out that there is a lot of research that's been done by a lot of other excellent social psychologists and researchers that has documented that across a number of different behaviors, people from working class contexts are more attentive to other people, they're more socially responsive, they're more empathically accurate. They engage in a lot of these behaviors that could be classified as interdependent. And when you bring those findings to the organizational behavior literature on groups and teams, it turns out that those things actually map onto effective group performance. So these are things that we know would actually make teams perform better. And so we wanted to try to code to see if that might explain some of this relationship. And what we ended up doing is coded for a number of these effective team behaviors. And this is actually a picture of two of our participants from the study actually working on the task together. And one thing that actually emerged as a significant explanation for why these working class teams were outperforming the middle class ones was this idea of turn taking. And because this is sort of just two people working on the task together, what this really means is they were having a more active and balanced conversation. They were actually sort of eliciting each other's perspectives as they were working together on this task. And we tried to test the audio earlier, so I think this is working, but I can actually share with you kind of two audio recordings that kind of illustrate what I mean when I say they were taking lots of turns on the task. So first I'll kind of share with you an example of a group that was actually taking significant turn in conversation.
That's brilliant. Okay, yeah. All right. So going down, navigational tool, do you think it's still important from these choices?
I think like the most, then again, if we're not trying to if we're trying to get rescued, then like the navigation tool is not that important actually.
Okay, right? And so is the map of the line negotiation.
Yeah, so these are probably the bottom based on our objective.
Right.
All right, and so you can either hear or see visually in this transcript that the participants are really giving each other space. They're both kind of equally contributing to the conversation, and their conversation is they're really building on each other's ideas, working towards this joint solution. So that really illustrates nicely this idea of frequently taking turns in conversation. To just kind of highlight sort of the extreme opposite end of the spectrum, I can now share with you a group that really characterizes this more infrequent approach to turn taking.
I'll put a question mark next to it if that's a possibility. I'm gonna put this as the transistor radio is 13 because it's just to listen to music. So we can rank that pretty low. I think our next goal should be protection.
All right, let's rank this first.
All right. So again, I chose particularly salient examples to really highlight the differences here, but you can see, and perhaps you could hear in this transcript, that it maybe doesn't even seem as though participant A has a partner in this case. She's really leading the conversation. Participant B is not really contributing at all, and in fact, when he kind of does join the conversation later, he's not really building on her ideas. He's like, okay, now I want to talk about my thing. Let's do this one next. So again, it really kind of highlights the differences here. And so when we sort of do the statistical model, which I won't share with you, it does indicate that this turn taking, so taking more frequent turns in conversation, actually helps to explain why our groups from working class backgrounds were actually outperforming. So we saw that our groups from working class contexts were taking more turns in conversation, and that in turn actually predicted their better performance on this task. So kind of in this first part of the talk, I've kind of shared with you a couple studies that suggest that people from working class contexts can actually have better experiences and perform better when they're working together compared to when they're working individually, and in certain cases can even outperform their counterparts from middle class backgrounds, and it seems as though this is because perhaps they have greater comfort or greater skill or greater competency in actually working together effectively with others. But then again, I didn't want to leave it sort of in college. I wanted to find out kind of what happens next after these students graduate from college and head off to the workplace. So we wanted to know whether or not we could sort of see this benefit of working together playing out in the workplace as well. So again, like where we've come so far in the talk today is that this idea of working together, this experience of working together actually really creates a cultural match where students from working class backgrounds feel like they can perform up to their potential. And this is also kind of joined by lots of other research which has documented sort of similar phenomena, indicating that people from working class contexts tend to be more socially responsive, more compassionate, more attentive to others. They are more interested in pursuing a position of power when it is framed as a way to sort of help others or bolster the community as opposed to sort of individual gain. And once they actually make it into leadership positions, they are rated by their subordinates as engaging in more of these relational behaviors, as displaying sort of less entitlement and narcissism, and actually being rated as a better leader. So all of that indicates that, working together should be a beneficial experience in the workplace as well. But we wanted to make sure, is that really enough? Is it enough to actually work together or engage in this interdependent behavior to create a cultural match in the workplace? So the first step that we had to engage in is to still understand if we still have people endorsing these more interdependent motives for work, right? At the beginning of the talk, I shared with you how first-generation college students endorse these more interdependent motives for college. But what happens after you've had years to navigate through the university, head off into your career? Are we still sort of seeing these social class differences in motives, or do people change and the norms change along with them? And so we adapted that exact measure that I shared with you at the beginning of the talk, but instead for kind of your motivation for working on those same items. And they had items that were sort of tapping into this more individualistic, independent model of self. And so what's really interesting to note here is that there actually is no social class difference in independent motives in this large sample of employees, and they were at all different stages of their career. So it does sort of begin to indicate there is potential for some cultural change, or these working class students actually, once they graduate and sort of navigate these middle class workplaces, kind of becoming more comfortable or more familiar with this independent set of norms. But most importantly, what we see when we look at those interdependent motives is that working class people from working class backgrounds, are still endorsing these interdependent motives to a greater extent than their middle class counterparts. And so we theorize that that's probably enough reason why working together would still sort of confer this unique potential advantage in the workplace. And so now what we see, again, going back to this idea of cultural mismatch, we see that even after graduating college, navigating out into these white collar jobs, that our employees from working class backgrounds are still continuing to endorse these more interdependent motives for work. But what about white collar workplaces? What values and norms are enacted and valued in these contexts, right? Workplaces are a lot more diverse and varied than institutions of higher education. So we wanted to sort of understand that landscape and, what is this actually going to create a cultural mismatch for these individuals? And so starting with purely just working together, actually working in teams, working collaboratively, we see potentially evidence of a positive effect for individuals from working class backgrounds. And that is because collaborative work has grown extensively in the past 2 decades, right? So there are frequent opportunities to work together in teams and enact this interdependent behavior at work. And so kind of building on my last findings, we would hope that that maybe suggests that there's opportunities to create a cultural mismatch at work. But it becomes a bit more complicated when you then take into account what these organizations tend to value, and it paints a bit of a different picture. And so unfortunately, organizations, though they tend to increasingly rely on teamwork, they often fail to value that as part of what it means to be a good employee at the organization. So a recent survey suggested that only 23% of employees actually feel that the work they're doing on a day-to-day basis is actually valued by their organization. And more specifically, thinking about teamwork and collaboration, another recent survey looked at organizations' sort of stated values and employees' sort of reports of what they actually did in the organization, and they found absolutely no correlation between an organization claiming to value collaboration and teamwork and interdependent behavior and what employees were actually doing on a day-to-day basis at that organization. So that led us to think that we need to look not only at what people are doing on a day-to-day basis in the organization, are they actually having these opportunities to work together, but also what is valued. What does it mean to be a quote unquote good employee at this organization? And we need to look at those two pieces together to understand the experience of cultural mismatch in workplaces. So you can imagine, as many organizations do, it seems to be that you have frequent opportunities to work together in teams. But as we saw, many organizations likely continue to sort of value individual contributors and sort of assess people as individuals. And we theorize that this would create a cultural mismatch again for our employees from working class backgrounds, leading them to not feel as though they belonged as much at that organization, and also not to desire to kind of stay working at that organization. In contrast, we theorize that, in an organization where people have frequent opportunities to work together, and it's also actually a valued part of being an employee of that organization, that this would be sort of the right combination to actually create the cultural match, leading our employees from working class contexts to actually feel better and feel a stronger desire to stay at that organization. So we did this across a number of studies, but again, I'll just share with you the experiment for the purposes of our talk today. We kind of created our own workplace simulation experiment. So we brought participants into a study and told them they were going to be working today for this organization, and then gave them the opportunity to learn a little bit more about the organization before engaging in a work task at that organization. And so to kind of map onto those two elements that I was talking to you about, we varied both kind of what they were doing and what they heard about the organization. So upon entering the experiment, participants read an organizational culture message, and I'll share with you what that looked like in just a moment. And we varied whether or not it emphasized working together versus individually as part of being a good employee. Then we actually had them work together on a task with someone that they thought was another participant, but in reality was a trained research assistant who was trained to enact behavior with them in one of two ways, which I'll also share with you in just a moment. So what did it look like, sort of this valued behavior message that they received upon sort of entering the experiment? So we kind of created this mock website. We tried to make it look as realistic as possible. And throughout the culture page, you see a lot of things about how being an individual is kind of the right way to be successful at the organization, right? So in the sidebar, we see, individuals are the reason for our success. In the text, if you can read it, it's like, this is a great environment for those who are skilled at taking charge, getting their own work done. Individual contributions are really valued here. In contrast, the other half of the time, participants saw very similar. It looks almost identical, except that it varied and it said, teams really are the reason for our success at this organization, and it's a really good place for people who are skilled at working together with others, and we assess people's contributions to teams to kind of assign employee bonuses. So we're creating this sort of message that emphasizes that working together or working individually is what it means to be a good employee at this organization. Again, I mentioned we varied another element, so then we actually brought them into a chat room. So this was an online experiment. We brought them into a chat room where they actually worked on a work-relevant task, and we had this trained research assistant kind of encourage them to work either together interdependently or to take more of this divide and conquer, work individually approach. And so this is actually kind of like what the chat transcript looked like, but half the time in this sort of divide and conquer condition, right at the top of the conversation, the research assistant would say, hey, do you mind if we divide and conquer, right? To work on this individually and then come back together at the end. And so you can kind of see visually in the transcript that, they talk for a little bit, then there's no chats going back and forth. They just kind of work on the ideation task individually, and then they come back together at the very end of the talk to kind of synthesize their results. In contrast, in the other half of the cases, the research assistant actually asked them, hey, do you mind if we brainstorm together? And so you can see there aren't any gaps in this conversation. They're really kind of going back and forth the whole time throughout the conversation, working together in this much more interdependent fashion. So again, we have sort of similar outcome measures to what I shared with you in the last experiment, right? After participants went through this experience of working together, either in this divide and conquer fashion or this more interdependent fashion, we had them complete a survey that assessed, how much do you feel like you would fit in or belong at this organization? How much do you feel like, you would have the right skills to get ahead in this organization? And importantly, this was a sample of all employees from working class backgrounds. And so what we see when we look at the results, I really want to draw your attention to the far right-hand bar here. And so you can see there's really no differentiation in any other conditions, but when this enacted behavior of working together is actually coupled with this value of working together, we actually see our employees from working class backgrounds reporting a greater sense of fit at that organization, suggesting this cultural match. We see a very similar pattern of results when we look at this other outcome measure, which is their self-reported desire to actually continue working at that organization in the future. Again, we see really no differentiation in the other conditions, but when we look particularly at this sort of coupled experience of working together and it actually being valued by the organization, our employees from working class backgrounds are indicating that they would like to stay working at that organization because it's a place for people like them. So kind of bringing it all together, it suggests that in the workplace, it's really important not just to look at what people are doing on a day-to-day basis in their job, but also what's being valued by the organization. And it's really this combination of working together and feeling as though that's a valued behavior at the organization that creates this experience of cultural match. But I want to connect back to the top of the talk where I kind of talked about all of these sort of social class gaps that we see generally emerging in these white-collar workplaces. You might be surprised seeing these results and thinking, well, there are certainly types of organizations where employees from working class backgrounds actually can report feeling a greater sense of fit and a greater desire to stay with the organization compared to their middle-class counterparts. So how could we possibly be seeing all of these social class gaps? In another study in that paper, we had this was nationally representative of the US, but a nationally representative survey where we had people kind of report on what they did on a day-to-day basis in their job and also what the values of their organization were. And it turns out that only 31% of employees in that sample actually reported being at the type of organization that would actually bolster the experiences and outcomes of our employees from working class backgrounds. So the vast majority of organizations, nearly 70%, are not the type of organization that would actually create this cultural match. So then again, in taking this to the workplace, we see that it's really this coupling of enacted and valued interdependent behavior that leads to this experience of cultural match. And we had a number of other studies in the paper that I don't have time to share with you today, but I'm happy to talk about any of those offline. So across the talk today, we've sort of seen evidence that if we kind of restructure our institutions and our environments in ways that are better set up to recognize the unique strengths of employees from working class backgrounds, we can actually bolster their experiences and make them feel as though they're included in these organizations. But I'm going to close with something that I don't normally do. Normally as an academic researcher, I stay really close to my data, but I felt the need to try to have some concrete recommendations, practical implications of my research for this audience. And so I had to think a lot about what I thought would be like 3 key takeaways that I want everyone to leave here with today. And so the first one, I think we've been hearing a lot across all of the talks and sessions that we've had today. But again, against this sort of deficit narrative, I think it's really critical for first-gen students to actually recognize their background as a unique source of strength that can set them apart. And I have quotes from that interview study that I shared with you earlier to kind of highlight this idea. So again, another one of my interviewees, Samuel, from a working class background, he was reflecting on his time in the workplace and he said, my social class background let me be more proactive, more insightful, more thoughtful than my colleagues who came from more privileged backgrounds, really highlighting that he was able to sort of identify his background as a strength and leverage that to be successful at work. The second sort of takeaway that I'd love to leave you all with is the idea that you are empowered to sort of seek out these contexts and environments and institutions that will actually align with your values and they'll recognize your unique strengths, right? We saw that not all organizations are the type of organizations that would create this cultural match for employees from working class backgrounds, but there are organizations out there that will recognize and value your collaborative strengths. And so another one of my interviewees, William, also from a working class background, described sort of the experience of working at an organization that recognized his unique strengths. He said, at my most recent job, one of the buckets that they evaluated you on was the ability to connect with people. I think my upbringing helped me to easily connect with people who are different from me. It's very attuned for me, having grown up speaking to very different people. I feel like that definitely is a strength of my background. Again, highlighting the sense that he could sort of recognize that he could have this unique advantage and that it was actually appreciated by his organization. And then the last sort of takeaway is, it's absolutely not the responsibility of first-gen individuals to, take on all the onus of changing institutions from within, but I do think that you bring a really unique perspective and you have these unique abilities to actually sort of make different groups of people feel comfortable and included in spaces, and I think that can be really an empowering strength that you bring to organizations once you're sort of in the organization. And I'll close with just one last quote from one of my interviewees, Morgan, and she described her social class background enabled her to relate, to interact with, and create rapport very easily with people of very different backgrounds. I think I'm good at talking about things that multiple groups of people feel like they can contribute to. And so again, once you get into an organization, you do have these unique strengths and abilities to kind of create a space where many people are going to feel comfortable and able to perform up to their potential. And with that, I will thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions, but I would be remiss to not thank my amazing collaborators on this research.
You had talked about working class groups being stronger. Did you have them work with middle class groups, and then when they were working with them, if the middle class person was more individualistic and like was trying to do stuff on their own, did the working class person ever try to like get them to work with them or like try and push that, or did they just like give up and default to whatever the middle class person was trying to do?
It's a really great question. So, did we have groups where there were both middle and working class students, and did like the middle class students sort of try to dominate the conversation and like kind of turn it more into this like more individualistic divide and conquer style? So the college course grade study that I shared with you, we did have sort of naturally randomly put together groups. So there was groups that had no working class students all the way to groups with 3 or more working class students. And this was out of like 6 to 8 students total. And what we see is that there really isn't any benefit of being a solo working class member in a group. It looks kind of the same as groups that didn't have any students from working class contexts. The advantage starts to unlock when there's at least 2 people from working class backgrounds. And so it's not direct evidence to what you're asking about, but it does to me indicate that you really need to have other people who are in the group who are actually going to be able to work interdependently, and you can actually kind of leverage each other's strengths. Like if you're kind of a solo working class member, maybe the rest of the middle class people sort of take over and say, okay, we're just gonna divide and conquer. And we had another large study of student athletes in that paper as well, and it was the same sort of story where only when there was sort of an increasing percentage of first generation students on a team did first generation students actually report having a better experience. So I do think it suggests that it doesn't need to be 100% working class students, but there needs to be a critical mass to sort of start accruing these benefits.
As someone who supports students for career options out there,
Yeah.
really interesting to hear that, was it like 60 or 70% of careers out there are more about independent work values than interdependent? This may be an unfair question, but I'm curious. Did you notice segments of certain industries that were more predominant there versus in the interdependent values?
Yeah. That's a really great question. So importantly, that 70% number is not only just having individual values, it's also organizations where you don't work together. So it's kind of, because we only saw sort of this unique benefit for organizations where you actually work together on a regular basis at the job, and the organization tends to value that. So it's really that that combination of 2 that kind of creates the advantage. But absolutely, when I talk about this research, people ask me, like what types of jobs would actually, or organizations would be the ones that actually value working together. I think it's a great question for a next study. I can't really say for sure exactly what types of organizations these are. But I do know that, there are lots of types of consulting even, really requires a lot of teamwork. So there are definitely industries out there. What I would encourage though students to do is again, ask people who, do informational interviews, what are people actually doing on a day-to-day basis, and what is the organization truly valuing? So I think resources like Glassdoor, which is a website where people can post sort of anonymous employee reviews, can give you a lot of useful information, because I think what organizations present on their website, doesn't necessarily reflect what the actual experience of working there is like. So I think digging deeper and actually getting real employee experiences is what they should do.
Thanks, Andrew. That was great. Did the participants of your experiments know the class composition of the teams they were assigned to? And as just a quick second question, this reminds me a lot of research that has looked at gender and women being more collaborative workers, and knowing that has not necessarily benefited women, right? We still have a gender pay gap and in a management gender gap. So how do we move this forward?
Yeah, it's 2 big questions. So to your first question, no, they did not. We didn't make it explicit to them at all. Again, we had sort of pre-identified what their social class was, and we brought them into the lab and just told them when they were in the lab, you're going to be working on this by yourself, or you're going to be working on it with a partner. We were curious to see if people would pick up on the social class of their partner. So at the very, very end of the survey, after they completed all the important measures, we asked them, if you had to guess, what do you think the social class background of your partner is? And almost everyone thought they had a middle class partner. even though we had created intentionally these groups that were 100% working class. I think that's a function partially of the university where we did this, which was a relatively elite university. I think only about 13% of students there identified as first generation, but it does indicate that they were not aware kind of what the social class was. And it was the same in the college course grade data. Perhaps, I mean, I couldn't look at like what was actually happening in those groups because I got the data like after in sort of an archival fashion, but they were randomly assigned, and it's not something that would necessarily naturally come up in conversation, right? Like what's your social class background as we're working kind of on this class project. To your second question about connections with gender and sort of more communal versus agentic norms that we see kind of in gender, I do think that I connect, especially the research that I was sharing with you in the workplace, a lot to sort of these gender disparities. There's also a lot of literature and sociology about this concept of office housework, which is that women are sort of given more tasks in organizations that are not critical, like they're required to do them, but they're not critical to advancement. They're actually very devalued by the organization, and I really think that maps on nicely to what I'm seeing in my results, which is that we rely increasingly on teams in our organizations. We can't, our work is so complex these days that it can't really be done by individuals anymore for many organizations. But organizations have kind of failed to catch up in terms of their values. They're still sort of assessing people as individual contributors and as individual stars, quote unquote. So I think that's definitely an implication that I would bring when I bring sort of this talk to a more organizational audience, as I try to encourage them to reflect on what the values are and if those are actually aligned with what their employees are doing. So I do think that there needs to be some structural interventions that are done to kind of help organizations make sure that their behaviors of their employees are actually aligned with kind of the values of the organization.
I'd just like to say thank you. Oh, question. You.
So I was just thinking about how many students, I think especially undergrads, dislike group work. There's that meme, something like, I hope my group mates are there at my funeral so they can let me down one last time. Have you seen that one? So I wonder, when you have these mixed groups, is that, do you think, where you see more social loafing, like the continuing then students might offload some of the work to the working class students? And how do you think you could mitigate that so there's more fairness?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question. It's not something I've been able to necessarily look at in my research just yet, but I do see, we do see sort of this pattern where more first gens in a team is equated to sort of greater success in that team environment. I'm doing a replication study of that college course grade study at a predominantly first gen serving institution right now, and in our pilot data we actually see that the benefit goes all the way up to having 100% first gen students in the group. Like, those groups are actually performing better than even groups with 85%. So I do think it suggests that it really is being driven by like the first gens doing a really great job, and there's really no added benefit, it seems, of having middle class students on the team. So I do think perhaps that is indirectly evidence that middle class people really don't like working together in teams. I didn't really call a lot of attention to the middle class results, but if you remember the sense of fit results in that experiment, the middle class people report having a lower sense of fit when they're working together than when they prefer to work individually than work together. So I do think that is an issue. And so another kind of implication when I talked more to organizational audiences about this work is that I'd say we need to sort of train all people on how to be effective collaborators. Right? It shouldn't be the sole responsibility of working class people who are already sort of naturally more skilled or comfortable with working together to kind of carry the team. And so I actually have the opportunity to teach an organizational behavior class at my university, and we do a unit on groups and teams. And so I try to teach them about social loafing and how, to work interdependently and actually build on each other's ideas and coordinate effectively, and not just sort of all individually work on each of their slides and then bring it together at the end, because it's very obvious. I don't know if you've ever seen a PowerPoint presentation where each person did their slide alone, and then the first time they're presenting it is in front of the audience. It's very, very obvious. So I do try to sort of bring some of this into my teaching, but I think there needs to be more done. And I think, again, it is a critical thing for organizations to have effective teams. So I think it would really behoove them to actually train all of their employees, particularly their middle class employees, on how to work together more effectively.
Well, and I'm just thinking about the premise of your talk is more strengths-based, and then we've been talking a lot about social and cultural capital. again, bringing it back to the student context, like I wonder if there's even some skills training for the middle class students, how to be better collaborators.
Absolutely,
in
I think it's
university.
specifically should be targeted at middle class people. Yeah, they're the ones that don't feel comfortable and don't enjoy. They would rather just divide and conquer and work on by themselves. Yeah.
Well, if you have any ideas on that, please share them.
I'm taking over the mic. Does anyone else have any other final questions? So I would like to really thank you so much for coming and sharing your research on strength-based approach, all the strengths that working class and first-gen students bring to teamwork. So thank you so much, everybody.
That was awesome.
I guess we have a little break, is that right?
Yeah. We are going to have a coffee break, and then at 4 o'clock, there's the learning skills, sorry, I'm a little bit tired, learning skills for students. And there's going to be a reception at 5:30 at the Upper Lounge. Okay, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Andrea and Wolfgang, and also Alfred for the beautiful talks. We were really lucky and privileged to have you here today. Thank you so much.